Good afternoon or good morning to all of you, depending on where you're calling from. I will discuss this paper that Gert Sebastian and I wrote on the interplay between oil and food commodity prices and whether or not it has changed over time. On this first slide, I show you the motivation, really the motivation for this paper, and that is in blue you can see a food commodity price index, and in black you can see an oil price index. And academics, policymakers, people in international institutions have looked at similar figures like this one, and they inferred from it that somewhere since the mid-2000s, something may have happened to oil and food commodity markets that has tied their prices together. And actually, if you look at the correlation coefficients computed over the growth rates of these two time series, they seem to confirm this hunch that you can infer from the data. I show you here in figure 2, 3 different measures of correlation over time. And all 3 measures of correlation indicate that in more recent periods, correlations are more positive and more significant, while they were in the 1990s and early 2000s, they were negative and insignificant. And so just from the mechanics of commodity markets, you can think of 2 potential drivers from this increased correlations. First of all, this increased unconditional correlation between food commodity prices and oil commodity prices can just be the result of the fact that common demand factors that shift both prices in both markets in the same direction have started to become an increasingly important factor compared to idiosyncratic market-specific supply shocks. So if that is the case, if these common demand factors have become more important in driving the price dynamics in both markets, then what you would see is, of course, an increase in the unconditional correlation between both prices, which is what I've showed you on the previous slide. And there are some reasons why that would be the case, but that will not be the focus of this paper. We will be talking about a second potential driver for the increased correlation, and that is direct price spillovers from oil prices to food prices and from food prices to oil prices. So we are thinking here of commodity-specific price shifts, so an exogenous food price change that spills over to oil prices, and exogenous oil price changes that spill over to food prices. And we're thinking of price shifts that are completely orthogonal to these common drivers that I highlighted on this previous slide, for example. And one can think of 2 potential rationalizations for the emergence of this kind of spillovers. And it's first of all the emergence of biofuel production. The years 2000s, they have seen a strong increase in biofuel production, which means that which means that there is an increased potential to substitute carbon sourced from fossil fuels with carbon from renewable sources, agricultural output. And these increased substitution possibilities may link prices of food and oil commodities together. An alternative rationalization for the emergence of direct price spillovers is informational frictions. So I'm referring here to a model that was developed by Zhoping and Xiong in Journal Finance in 2015. And they start from the observation that commodity prices are often used or often interpreted as being informative for the stance of the global business cycle. And if that is the case, then if you take, for example, an adverse oil supply shock, if there is an adverse oil supply shock that increases oil prices, market participants may see this increased oil prices, but they may infer from this wrongly an upturn in the global business cycle. They would see oil prices increase, and because they may use oil prices as a signal of global economic activity, they may infer from this oil price increase an upturn in the global business cycle, even though it was just adverse oil supply shock. But in response to this misinterpretation, goods producers would then increase their commodity demand across the board. So commodity demand would increase for a variety of commodities. And this would then show up as a spillover from oil prices to other commodities. This is an alternative reason next to the biofuel story why price spillovers may have emerged over the course of the 2000s. And of course, we are not the first one to discuss spillovers between oil and food prices, but we do think that there are a number of important drawbacks to existing studies that are investigating the same question. And it's first of all, existing studies often focus exclusively on transmission of the spillovers via biofuels. Second, existing studies tend to use reduced form methods to investigate spillovers, which means that they cannot disentangle spillovers from true spillovers through causal effect of one commodity price and another. They cannot disentangle this from common factors that shift both prices in the same direction. That's option one explanation that I introduced before. They cannot disentangle these common drivers from really causal effects from across commodity markets. Some papers do have a structural model, but in that case, they're focusing exclusively on a unidirectional causality. So they would be only interested in the causal effect of oil price changes on food prices, but not on the causal effect of food prices on oil prices. And in addition, I showed you or I tried to show you that there is probably some time variation over the course of the 1990s and the 2000s. This time variation usually in the literature is modeled as a sample split. Researchers often decide on a sample split and they assume that the data generating process went from a non-biofuel regime to a biofuel regime without allowing for any gradual introduction of spillovers, for example. And we are tackling those drawbacks in different ways. So first of all, we come with clear identifying assumptions that allow us to interpret the causal effects from oil prices to food prices and also from food prices to oil prices. Second, we will be using time varying parameter VERs, and we will be not taking an ex ante stance on the shape or or on how the time variation looks like. The time variation that I will show you in the results will be entirely data driven. And third, because we do not dogmatically focus on transmission via biofuels, we will be able to actually show some results that favor the informational frictions narrative over the biofuel narratives as the main driver of the spillovers. Are there any questions at this point already, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, there is a question from Chiang Mai. It says that it seems that the correlation has been reverting back after 2015. Is it true in the data?
Yes, and this will also come back in the results later on in the presentation. That's a very correct observation. Exactly. Okay, so let's discuss the empirical approach. I have 3 slides here, one on the model, one on the data, and a slide on the identification. So first, the model. We will be using 2 time varying parameter structural vector autoregressions with stochastic volatility. And one VER we will use to identify a food supply shock. We will be using food production, food prices to identify a food supply shock. And from this VER, we will check the response of the oil price. And then we have a second VER where we identify an oil supply shock using oil production and oil prices, and then we check the food price response following an oil supply shock. So the data that we need for the estimation are 4 time series. It's first a food production index that we take from Brookings paper by Jasmin and Heersman. This is a harvesting index that collects on a quarterly frequency harvest volumes across the world. We use a food price index, which is an aggregated index of the spot prices of the 4 crops that enter the food production index. And for oil prices, we use fairly standard US refiners acquisition cost of imported crude oil. And the oil production series comes from the US Energy Information Administration. Our data starts in 74 Q1 after the deregulation of oil markets. We use a number of quarters to estimate as a training sample to initialize the algorithm. And then the results that I will be showing you will range from 988 Q3 to 2016 Q4. This is the estimation sample. And then, of course, the identification. I mentioned it already before. The vehicle that we are going to use to identify the spillovers are commodity-specific supply shocks. So these commodity-specific supply shocks are orthogonal to common drivers, to shocks that are common to both markets, and that way we can properly exclude that our results are driven by common demand shift, for example, that are common to both food and oil markets. So if we observe positive price movement between food prices and oil prices conditioning on a food supply shock, there will be a spillover from oil prices to food prices. And if we observe positive price movement between food price and oil prices conditional on oil supply shock, there will be a spillover from oil prices to food prices. The food supply shock is identified in a very simple way, because since there is a 1 quarter lag between the planting decision of the farmer and the harvesting, so the actual production of the food output. So there is this 1 quarter lag between planting and harvesting, which means that the last period where the farmer can respond to price incentives or to demand conditions is in the planting, is in a quarter of planting. And then he has to wait for at least 1 quarter before he can harvest and see how much he will be harvesting. So the harvest surprises that we're seeing, they cannot reflect demand conditions, which means that we can just use the reduced form VR innovation as a structural shock. So it boils down to a Cholesky factorization of the reduced form VR residuals with ordering food production first. And the oil supply shock is identified via sign restrictions. So very standard, we are just assuming that an adverse oil supply shock reduces oil production and increases oil prices. And then, are there any questions at this point? New questions?
No.
If not, all right. Then we are ready to have a look at the results. Sorry?
Sorry, let me remind people that if they have a clarifying question, just write it down in the Q&A section.
Yeah, perfect. So then we can have a look at the results, right? So on the left, I show you the responses of the oil VR, of oil production and the oil price in the oil VR. And on the right, I show you the responses of food production and the food prices from the food VR. What you can see from here, first of all, is the identifying restriction on the oil supply shock. So an adverse oil supply shock reduces oil production and increases oil prices. You can also see that this behavior over time of the oil price response being lower in the mid-1990s and increasing and reaching a peak around 2008. This pattern over time is very comparable to existing research in the literature already. So that's very reassuring. You can also see that stochastic volatility plays an important part, because the size of the effect of a one standard deviation supply shock, both for the oil shock and for the food shock, it varies considerably over time. So stochastic volatility is an important ingredient. And then finally, you can also observe that we don't put a restriction here, right? So the data just tells us that an exogenous reduction in food production increases food prices. is a standard price. The responses of interest, of course, are a food price response in the oil VAR and the oil price response in the food VAR. These are the spillover variables. But before we have a look at it, let's go through two exercises. First of all, to facilitate interpretation, let's normalize the size of an oil supply shock to be a 1% shock, a 1% to reduce oil production by 1% over time. So we're normalizing the responses of the oil VR to reflect the response after a 1% exogenous reduction in oil production. And we do the same for the responses in the food VR. We rescale them so that at each point in time, they reflect the response of the variables after a 1% food supply reduction. So this is some normalization that we do. We reflect the impact responses to reflect the responses after 1% drop in production. And second of all, to facilitate interpretation a little bit, let's compute the change in the price response with respect to a benchmark quarter. So we can select a benchmark quarter, and from there, instead of showing for each quarter the impact price response, we can compute for all of the subsequent quarters to what extent the price response in all of those quarters differs from the price response in this benchmark quarter. So we will select the benchmark quarter as the period where the spillover is the smallest. And so what you see here are estimates of the time variation and the VRs and the associated uncertainty with this time variation. And these guys are the counterpart of these two interesting plots. So we want to look at these two, the food price response of the oil supply shock and the oil price response of the food supply shock. And what you see is a gradual but a substantial increase in the food price response after an oil supply shock, reaching a maximum around 2008 and then decreasing again. And so this is in line with the question before, right? We saw the unconditional correlation between the oil prices also dropped near the end of the sample. So this is also, we can see it here as well. And similarly for the oil price response after the food supply shock, the responses increased over time, gradually but substantially, reached a maximum around 2008, and then dissipated again to some extent. So let's think now to what extent this documented time variation is consistent with either a biofuel production story or the informational friction story. Well, actually, I won't elaborate on it too much, but this gradual increase in spillover and a decline after 2008 is actually very much in line with what you would expect based on biofuel production. If you're interested, we can talk about it later, but I would like to focus on the informational friction, because also this acceleration over the course of the 2000s and a deceleration after 2008 is in line with what you would expect based on financial frictions of the informational frictions in commodity markets. And this is because, first of all, the 2000s, because since over the course of the 2000s, more information is aggregated into commodity markets because of financialization. Financialization made sure that commodity markets became more integrated globally, and therefore more information is aggregated in commodity markets. So for market participants, goods producers, it pays off more to look at commodity prices now to infer something on the stance of the global business cycle. Simultaneously, over the course of the 2000s, the signal that one would want to derive from commodity prices has become more important to look at because there has been substantial uncertainty over the course of the 2000s that increased over the course of the 2000s. For example, there was large, strong growth emerging Asia, but the actual strength of the growth, there was considerable uncertainty around the strength of the growth. There was a lot of economic growth there, but there was some uncertainty around, how large is this growth precisely. Similarly, for the global financial crisis, it had devastating effects across the globe, but at the moment that the financial crisis hit, it was very unclear how strong the effect would be on the global business cycle. So those are reasons why market participants may have attached an increased value to the signal that they could derive from commodity prices over that period. Also, the deceleration of the spillovers that we saw after 2008 are in line with the financial frictions because, for example, after 2002, oil shocks reflected to a large extent strategic interaction of Saudi Arabia, and also food shocks were well understood because they resulted from very large drafts across the globe. So if market participants could very clearly understand that price shifts in that period were resulting from supply shocks rather than from a global business cycle, they would never end up misinterpreting the commodity price shift, and they would not adjust their commodity demand accordingly. Now, to elaborate a little bit on this informational friction story, I want to show you two additional pieces of evidence. And first of all, I will show you evidence that these commodity-specific supply shocks also spill over to non-energy, non-food commodities. And this you would never expect if the biofuel sector was the transmission channel for these spillovers. Because these non-energy, non-food commodities, they have nothing to do with these substitution possibilities between oil and food. And second, I will show you some interpretation of the source of some evidence on a misinterpretation of the source of the price. So that's next. What we do is we estimate extra time varying parameter VER. So again, a food VER. And in this food VER, we will now check the price response of metal price index, and the response of an agricultural raw materials price index. We take these time series from the World Bank. And the same for the oil shock. These are the results. What you can see is the oil shock spillover to metal prices is very, very similar to the oil shock spillover towards food prices. And the food shock spillover to metal prices is very, very similar to the food shock spillover to oil prices. And this you would not expect if the transmission of the spillovers was due to the biofuel sector, then metal prices and agricultural raw material prices should not respond. So on this misinterpretation, we can do a similar exercise. We take the oil VER, and instead of we identify the oil shock, and instead of checking the food price response or metal price response or agricultural raw material price response, we check the response of the OECD composite leading indicator and the response of the business conditions index, which are global measures of the business cycle. And also here we can see that oil supply shocks and adverse oil supply shock over the course of the 2000s, as the spillovers materialize, these supply shocks are increasingly optimistically interpreted. Same for the business conditions index, and the same holds for the food supply shock. As the spillovers emerge in our sample, this is associated with a more optimistic interpretation of the supply shocks, of the adverse supply shocks. Are there any questions at this point?
There is another question, but I think you already answered it. But anyways, Ernesto Pastén asked, why is that the sample ends on 2016? From the figure in the intro, it seems there is a decoupling between food and oil prices.
So the sample ends in 2016 because that is the data that we have available for the food supply shock. And it is very true that from these correlation measures, you would understand a new decoupling of the oil and food prices. And this matches the time variation that we detect in the spillovers. So I think that answers this question. If not, I am happy to elaborate later on. All right, I have 2 more slides very quickly. First, I would like to show you some robustness from a 3-variable linear VR. So we're doing the same exercise. We take a food VR, oil VR, we identify a food supply shock and an oil supply shock, and then we check the responses of first food prices, metals prices, and the prices of agricultural raw materials in the food VR and in oil VR. Just as a robustness check, what we see is in the early sample in green, the impact response of all commodity prices to both commodity shocks, to both commodity supply shocks is negative or insignificant. While in the more recent sample in blue, there are considerable spillovers that we can also now detect in the linear VR. So this is as a robustness check. But we also use this linear VR in levels to check the importance of the spillovers on inflation dynamics. Again, the oil shock is on the left and the food supply shock is on the right. And what you see is that in the early sample, the oil supply shock had an insignificant or a negative effect on US food price index, while in a more recent period, an adverse oil supply shock that increases oil prices and now also increases food prices due to the spillover has actually also a substantial effect on food price inflation. And the same holds for the food supply shock in the US. So in earlier samples, the earlier sample runs from 88 Q3 until 2004 Q4. In this earlier sample, the energy CPI responds negatively or insignificantly after an adverse oil supply shock, but increases after an adverse food supply shock. So adverse food supply shocks now propagate via the spillover into energy CPI. And the same holds for the United Kingdom, actually.
Excuse me, Wouter, you have 5 minutes left.
Well, you will be very happy to see that I am reaching my conclusion. Let's just quickly recap. So what I have tried to show you with this presentation is that since the 2000s, exogenous price shifts in oil and food commodity markets have resulted in price spillovers to the other market. I also tried to show you that these spillover-induced price shifts, they are probably more likely to be related to informational frictions instead of the traditional assumption that they are due to the biofuel sector. Remember that I showed you that also non-energy, non-food commodities responded or were subject to the spillover, and that also the business conditions index and the composite leading indicator indicated a more optimistic interpretation of supply shocks, which is in line with this informational friction story. And then finally, very quickly at the end, I showed you that these spillovers, that they may be important for inflation dynamics in the UK and in the US. Thank you very much.